Well, that's nice. There's an old adage about you can never come home, but I guess that's not really true, at least in this instance. I feel very welcomed, and thank you all for coming out. This is a really nice tribute. The presentation, before I get into it, will really be a discussion about the various schemes and proposals that came up to cross the Detroit River, and then we will end the PowerPoint discussion and then see a video which was produced by Jack Kausch, who was from Birmingham, and Betsy, his wife, is here tonight. And it's a very interesting video. So I won't talk much about the tunnel itself because the documentary that Jack produced really tells the story, plus it has actual film footage from the construction in the late 1928, 29, and 30. So it's really interesting. But anyways, again, I'm really happy and pleased to be here. So this is the introduction, and this is my opportunity at this point to plug my new institution. Let me see if we can get the lights turned down. I'm not sure. Does anyone remember the switch over here? Let's see. Second one. All right. Okay. Great. All right. Well, I went from Birmingham to this. It's all relative, as far as the institutions go. But what it is, it's an interesting institution that's been around over 130 years now. The Kalamazoo Valley Museum was formally established, though, in 1927. But before that, there was a collection of oddities and curiosities that were collected by a local man named Albert Wood. And he was a man that learned to extract mint. And so part of his wealth and money came from the mint industry. But anyways, he collected all these things, eventually turned over his collection to the library, and then the library board decided that they had to create a museum. And this was all officially done in 1927. And then over the years, the museum moved to a couple different places. This is where you really learn about history is always changing, and in this case, the where history was being told was changing. So in 1996, 1997, this building was constructed. It was part of a $20 million campaign. The money was all publicly raised. That was part of it. They do have some big donors and deep pockets in Kalamazoo, but the specific agenda, or they thought it was very important that they collect. So from $1 donation, $10 donations to the very large donations, what led to the building of this museum. So it's a little bit more than just history. It's about 80% history as far as its collections. And then there's a whole science and technology component. The museum is driven by the fact that it wants to be very hands-on and make it an exploration. So when you go in, there's lots of activities for family and kids and children of all ages. So we're open year-round. There's only 4 days that we're not open. And it's a free institution, so you can't beat that. Part of that comes from the funding, which is by a perpetual millage, so we don't have to ask for a renewal. But because of the tax support, there's no reason why we feel we can charge an admission. So we forego that, and there are other ways for us to capture donations and other funds. But I won't tell you about that because I don't want to scare you away from the museum. But anyways, I hope that you can come out to Kalamazoo sometime and then take a tour, and I'd be more than happy to take you on a walking tour. I should say, on December 4th, if you get done with the train program, we also are opening a new history gallery, which is a huge redo of the current exhibit gallery, and that opens to the public on December 4th as well. So anyways, that's enough for the plug. Let's get to the story here. I got to read through my notes and a couple of these things, so bear with me. But when we, many of us living in this area between Detroit and Windsor, we have the wonderful opportunity to cross into Windsor and vice versa. And I think before 9/11, before those tragic events, we probably just took it for granted. And even since then, with the extra security and the time it takes sometimes to get through the border, we still make that crossing and come back and forth without really giving it too much of a thought. And I don't think that that's anything, I think that's just goes back to the long-term relationship that we've had between Canada and the U.S., and I think that speaks well for it. And so with that, let's start our discussion here. The Detroit River certainly was an important geographic resource or water resource for the earliest Native Americans, and certainly for the earliest pioneer settling of this area, both for Detroit and what later would become Windsor. The culture of both the farming and certainly fur trading, which really was the big economic driver in this area in the 1700s, really relied heavily on the Detroit River for transporting those goods and so on. But also going back to the fact that the water was important for our livelihood, for farming, and all those other concerns. So all these things were very important. So early on, trading became an important part of what we were all about. So here you get an idea with Fort Detroit and all the river traffic going here. Perhaps the artist here might have gone a little overboard, but it gives you an idea of how important the river was for all these activities. This area, the Detroit-Windsor area, was at one time part of one country, and it wasn't until after 1760 that we began to see the international borders being established. And then certainly by the end of the 1700s in 1796, that border became more an international border. Settlement to the area, just as we talk about, I know when we talk about Birmingham history, really increased when they opened up the Erie Canal, and that brought more people to the area, so that just led to more development of this community. So shipping early on, because of the Great Lakes Waterway, was very important to this trade and really helped with the development, the early development of Detroit as an economic center, from fur trading to later the early industries that took place here. And then in the 1830s, 1840s, the establishment of the railroads came in, and that too began what became a competition for the railroad interest and the Great Lakes shipping interest. So, and you'll see that in the next few slides that this competition was going back and forth, and at some points was very caustic. I mean, there was heated debates about use of the river and use of railroad to move goods. All right. Now, there was the first beginning of the discussion of the first crossing of the Detroit River began actually in 1869, and it was the early discussion was a tunnel. And you might not be surprised, but it was the Great Lakes shipping interest that did not want to see a bridge go across the river, and you'll see that continue on in the next 14 proposals that came along. But the technology certainly existed for tunnels under rivers, and this earliest one certainly, it was a pedestrian tunnel in London, but goes back to 1825, and then you can see that later a subway tunnel in Brooklyn adapted a similar type of technology to do so. So let me just tell you a little bit about what happened. Some of us might know who this gentleman is. James F. Joyce, who was the president of the Michigan Central Railroad, developed this plan for a tunnel under the Detroit River. He went out and hired an engineer from Chicago named Chesterborough, and the Chesterborough made a feasibility study and said certainly there could be a tunnel there. So they are looking at creating a tunnel crossing between what is St. Antoine in Detroit to Perrins Avenue in Windsor. And that's pretty close to where the current tunnel is today. But anyways, the tunnel was going to be a twin tunnel with a single track stretching 8,600 feet long. And that long length was required so that the train could have a slow, the grade had to be such so that the train could go down and actually come back up out of there. So, and this proposal actually moved forward. They began to construct on both sides of the river, and there was a labor dispute that broke out when the Canadian workers refused to accept payment in the weaker U.S. dollar at the time. In addition to that, they began to run into some problems. They didn't realize, the early testing of the area didn't realize that there were some hidden sulfur pockets, and when sulfuric gases, which ended up leaking, and it was a naturally occurring gas that ended up killing 2 of the workers. And by this time, Joy decided that it wasn't worth it. One, certainly the loss of human capital and these 2 individuals, but just the money that was having to be put in. And he felt that a public project would have to be pursued at some other point. So that ended the first project. So then the idea, though, was there. So someone else said, well, let's put a tunnel up. And you can see here it indicates a tunnel closer to using Belle Isle as sort of the crossing point. So let's see what was about that. In fact, this in 1873, they were looking at the Corps of Engineers from the U.S. government, looked at this and said, well, a bridge or a tunnel would certainly work here. And they began to look at creating this project. And this tunnel proposal was created to create the connection from Belle Isle to Windsor. And I'm not sure if they were going to tunnel over from the Detroit side to Belle Isle and then tunnel over from the other part. But I believe eventually this would actually be a bridge, then a tunnel crossing. So that didn't really go anywhere. The bridge proposal, initially supported by the Detroit Board of Trade as well as the local railroads, was to connect 2 spans of bridges from Trenton to Grosse Ile. So here they're jumping from Belle Isle all the way up to the north going south with the same idea. Now you can see in these illustrations, these are bridge crossing off the Mississippi, but you can see why the shipping interests would not be interested in trying to bring their ships underneath these low crossings. And the bridge technology, until a little bit later, had to have relatively short spans. They didn't have the suspension bridge technology developed as of yet. So, and just as a side note, these illustrations, this bridge on the Mississippi opened right at the beginning of the 1855, and then within 2 months, a barge actually hit one of the sections of this bridge, and it destroyed the bridge, and they rebuilt it a few years later. But that probably supported, the cause against building a bridge across the Detroit River. So the shipping interests probably were very interested in making sure everyone knew about that. So in 1879, they gave up on this. So they thought, well, they would do another tunnel project here across from Grosse Ile, and again, it ran into some problems. When they began to excavate, they found that the rocks and the formations there just didn't lend itself to a very substantial tunnel. So, okay, and then, all right. So again, they're going back to this 1880s. Again, the idea of a tunnel bridge discussion is brought up once again, and this is just an ongoing discussion. And if you read the Detroit papers, you get into all the arguments again from the shipping interest, the railroad interest, and so on. In 1879, 5 years after the first U.S. Corps of Engineering study, it was determined that any feasible river crossing for a railroad bridge would have to be up or down river from the 2 downtown districts. Now, This is one case where the shipping interest and the railroad interest agreed. They both came out against this report because the railroad interest did not want to be far from the downtown where all the business was taking place, and they felt at either end that they were too far from both the Windsor downtown and the manufacturing centers of both cities. So anyways, in that case, they both said, no, that's not going to work. If there's going to be any crossing, it has to be closer to the core downtown. All right, so in 1889, the U.S. Corps of Engineers again were asked to study the feasibility of a bridge or tunnel. So these guys made a good living at doing these feasibility studies. And so again, the idea, they brought it up again about being too far from downtown, and again, the idea was rejected. But in just up the river at Lake St. Clair, in 1891, a railroad tunnel crossing beneath the St. Clair River opened up to traffic, and that's up in Port Huron. And that crossing there, they realized the Detroit interest got very concerned about losing all of their trade to this northern city, and so they began to again push for another crossing. So in 1901. They began to look at, let me go back one, I'm sorry. Wanted to showcase this. This was a project that was going to be the two separate spans of bridges crossing the river, and they would form or have a junction on the Belle Isle River. And part of the plan was to create this peristyle look, and it was going to be quite the architectural marvel if they ever built it, but they ended up not doing that. So in 1901, there was another proposal that would, for $10 million, this bridge could be created. The railroad tracks would be required to lay across many of the large roadways in downtown Detroit. So right away, the planners at the time realized that people weren't going to be willing to wait for these trains to pass in these major downtown streets. So, and because of the long grade approaches, it was just going to tie up traffic for long periods of time. So they knew that that wasn't going to work. So this project was rejected, again, because of the inconvenience to the local ground traffic. But what it did do is this project led to the revitalization of a tunnel project. So in 1906 through 1910, we get the beginning of the tunnel construction, which led to this tunnel, a double tunnel. Let me tell you a little about that. This was a project that began on both sides in construction in 1906. And the trenches were dug 60 feet below the surface of the river, and airtight concrete tubes were floated down the river from St. Clair shores, and that's where they were built. And then by section, they were tipped and dropped into these trenches, and then connected, and then eventually created a 2,600-foot long tunnel, and it's actually about 2.5 miles. They were able to go from the Detroit side to the Windsor side. So in 1910, this opened up for traffic. And so then that began, and it took some of the pressure off of a bridge crossing with railroads on top of it, because the tunnel now existed. But, in 1912, with the centennial celebration of the War of 1812, they began to look at maybe creating another crossing in Detroit, just a designated car bridge. And this project didn't fly, but it, because of World War I, it sort of got in the way of the project beginning, so they just kind of let that set aside until the war was over. But after the war, James Cousin, who has connections to our community here in Birmingham, brought back the idea of creating both a car and a streetcar tunnel to make that crossing across the international border, and that his intent was to recognize the men, the servicemen from World War I as part of this project. So, but there was not going to be any railroad interest involved in this. So that was being pursued just for a short while. I think there was an issue with property acquisition, the cost of getting downtown Windsor and downtown Detroit property together in order to make this development go through. So this project was also passed. So, but not to give up. There's other projects that were presented, and in this case, there was the look at a two-tiered bridge for vehicles and train traffic. So that would have been kind of interesting. And this project's important because they began to really study where would be the key places for a crossing to occur if they were to go ahead with this double-decker bridge. The first site considered was certainly the Belle Isle to Walkerville idea, which had been rejected in the past because it was too far from the downtown. The second was, again, to look at the Woodward Avenue to the Olette Avenue in downtown Windsor. And again, though, the cost of land acquisition had to be considered because it was already a developed downtown, and there were a lot of people who were sitting on property and would be happy to sell at a high price. And then the third choice was to go down a little bit further south and establish a crossing at from 21st Street in Detroit to Huron Church. And then, as you know, that is actually where the Ambassador Bridge ended up going. So you can see that was the idea that would eventually win out. But the idea of a dual-purpose double-decker bridge didn't work out. So in 1922, another discussion about just a car bridge. I think now they're committed to the location where the Ambassador Bridge currently is. So they moved along from that proposal. And then, so from 1925 through 1929, the Ambassador Bridge proposal is pursued. And a couple of images. This is the major piers being developed and built, and the first span there. This is Assumption Church, which is now part of the University of Windsor. So we're looking at the Windsor side from Detroit. And in this picture, you can see the completed span, and that was in October of 1929 when they completed that. There was interesting discussion because at the same time, as you'll see in the video, there was discussion about this other tunnel proposal going on at the same time, and there was a debate between investors and supporters of both projects trying to just encourage people to support either one of the projects, and not, if you're going to be a bridge supporter, you're going to support the idea of developing slums at the base of each end of the bridges, and then, but on the other arguments, they talked about real estate development just booming once the bridge was in place. So there were debates on both sides, merits, and I think a lot of misinformation too about, what these proposals would do for the community. The U.S. government gave a permit for the use of building this bridge, and I think they really pushed it. The developers did not raise the sufficient funds right away. In fact, within about a week of the permit expiring for this construction project, they did get enough funding in place, and they actually broke ground on both sides of the river so that they could begin the project without losing their permit. So, anyways, and this then just represents all the projects that we've just talked about. I think I counted about 15 in all. Most of them were variations of the first projects proposed, but it's just a matter of getting the right investors together. The timing's important, public opinion's important. So all these things just played out, the way they did, just because of all the circumstances coming together. I will touch a little bit about the tunnel proposal, which came online really in earnest by 1927 when the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel Company was formed. Judson Bradway was named the first president. He was from Birmingham, lived in Grosse Pointe, but he was very active in the city planning in Detroit. He was a real estate man as well. So he knew the importance and the value of these crossings, and so it was just fitting that they would put him ahead of the company. And part of his project was to sell these bonds, or these certificate stocks for this project. And it's just interesting to see the illustration, the smokestacks, which is kind of interesting. That just shows a thriving industrial economy for both the U.S. side and the Canadian side. It's just kind of interesting. I don't know if you would see this same type of art or illustration being used to depict our success today. But anyway, so the certificates like this were sold, and the project moved forward. I should say about Mr. Bradway that one of the things that he did when he was president of the Detroit City Planning Commission is that he was certainly interested in developing the Detroit riverfront. So this is pretty revolutionary. Or concept, an idea that probably took about 80 years to really become underway. He was an advocate for the widening of Woodward north of 6 Mile, and again, to the benefit of developing Oakland County. He saw that by creating wider roads and an easier access that it lend itself to developing what was really a rural, sort of the outskirts of the city of Detroit. And with that, there'll be more of the story about the actual tunnel story in the dedication, but I did want to say that Mayor Fred Martin, who played a big role in this on the Windsor side, and his daughter Fern, who's age 13, is pictured there. You can see her on the Canadian side. And Judson Bradway's daughter Virginia, age 12, is on the other side right here. And the two of them are untying a ribbon as part of the ceremony. You see the radios. I think it must have been WJR was there, so there was a live radio broadcast, and there was a big celebration that took place when they were constructing the tunnel. And there'll be more on that shortly. So the tunnel was completed. These are just some postcards that were shared with me just recently, actually, so I thought I'd share them with you. And you can see the tunnel really hasn't changed too much. The white tile has been updated, but it's virtually the same look. And what's interesting about the lower postcard is you got the boat crossing the river, you got the buses, and then you also see the bridge there as well. So, so those are our crossings here in Detroit. And so there were at least 15 crossings that I was able to uncover up through November of 1930. And then, of course, there's possibility of a 16th crossing that, being debated or not debated, I think we might see a closure to this project, at least in the near future. But what's interesting about this graphic, it again identifies their crossings: Detroit-Windsor Tunnel, the rail tunnel, which is right here, and then, of course, the Ambassador Bridge. And this is the location of the proposed second bridge crossing here in Detroit. So, anyways, with that, I wanted to introduce the video that you're going to see, the documentary. I think it's 16 or 17 minutes long. And as I mentioned, Jack Kausch was hired, I guess, by the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel Corporation to produce a video. And part of the story, as I recall, and Betsy, you can jump in here, but they found some old nitrate films. A woman who was married to one of the engineers for the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel project had this box of film that was in an attic somewhere, and she got it in, and I think Jack must have been involved, or someone along there, in getting these things saved and converted. Nitrate is very dangerous, breaks down, and at some point it can be very dangerous actually to have around. But as you'll see in the video, it's really interesting to see how the tunnel was constructed, the engineering that went behind it. And I should say that just November 3rd, so just last week, the tunnel celebrated its 80th anniversary of being open to the public. So when Jack produced this video, it was done in 1980, so again, it was the 50th anniversary of is dated, but again, it's really the video of the bridge construction that you should really pay attention to. So with that, I'll have to get the video started, and just give me a minute to get this figured out. So.
On an average day, as many as 18,000 cars, trucks, and buses pass through the mile-long underwater tunnel connecting Detroit and Windsor. Up to 6 million persons use the tunnel in a single year. But travel between Windsor and Detroit hasn't always been this easy. Let's turn back the pages of history. Back to a time in the 18 and 1900s when ferry boats, hooting and tooting their way around river freight traffic, took as long as 10 minutes to get folks from one country to another, weather permitting. Back to a time when Fred Martin, a Salvation Army captain in Windsor, dreamed of building a great underwater tunnel to connect the bustling downtown areas of Detroit and Windsor. Mr. Martin lived to see his dream come true. Thanks to his determination and $26 million worth of private bank financing, tunnel construction began in June of 1928, when the dredge Gladiator raised the first bucket of mud from the Detroit River at the point where the tunnel would eventually lie. 3 separate tunneling methods were used to construct different sections of the tunnel: the open cut method, the trench and tube method, and the shield-driven method. All 3 were begun almost simultaneously, and the completion of each required careful scheduling so that all the sections could be united at about the same time. For the land approaches at either end of the tunnel, the open cut method was used. Workers simply cut a trench to a maximum depth of 53 feet and erected a box-type structure of steel and concrete, which subsequently was covered over with earth. The Canadian entrance was built in a straight line, which sloped gradually to the harbor line. The American entrance had to be built in a gradually descending spiral pattern because there was not enough undeveloped land available in Detroit for a straight line entrance. The middle or underwater section of the tunnel was the most spectacular of all the tunnel operations. It was constructed by the trench and tube method. The operation entailed the construction of 9 gigantic tubes built of steel on dry land outside of Windsor. Canal-like trenches were dredged out along the shore into which the tubes would eventually be launched from wooden launchways. In October 1928, the steel for the first of the tube sections was put into place. The steel plates, 3/8 of an inch thick, were stiffened with octagonal steel collars inside and out. All the plates were welded, riveted, and tested to ensure that each section was watertight. Extensive use of electrical welding, then a relatively new technology, enhanced the reliability of watertight seals. The ends of the tubes had to be sealed prior to launching into the canal. Special 10 by 10 watertight timber bulkheads were built for this purpose. The bulkheads were backed up by steel trusses and covered by inch-thick sheeting for water tightness. 8 separate layers of waterproofing were applied. Finally, to form the base of the tube, concrete was poured into wooden forms which were constructed along the bottom of the tube. This also served as a keel to help stabilize the tube when afloat. When completed, the tube section measured 31 feet across and 248 feet long. Tube A was launched first. The launching was a dismal failure. The canal had not been dredged deep enough for the tube to float. Workers looked on helplessly as the tube became immediately mired in the mud. To overcome this temporary setback, hollow wood pontoons had to be constructed, and the area to the side of the tube was dredged deeper. Once the pontoons were filled with water, they were sunk, then attached to the tube. Then the pontoons were pumped out, and as expected, the extra buoyancy from the pontoons helped float the tube. After launching, the tube was towed to a deeper slip, where more wooden forms were constructed around the sides and top of the tube. Concrete for the interior walls and roadway was also poured at this stage. The concrete was poured over reinforcing rods and steel forms, which held it in position until it hardened. When completely concreted, the circumference of each steel tube eventually was surrounded by a wall of interior and exterior concrete 36 inches to 42 inches thick. During the winter, construction continued on the remaining 8 tubes. All 8 were launched successfully and towed into the deeper slips for concreting. While the tubes were being readied, 6 miles upstream, dredging barges began the process of digging through the stiff gray clay at the bottom of the Detroit River. They were preparing a trench into which the underwater tube sections would eventually be sunk. When completed, the trench at its greatest depth was 85 feet below the surface of the water, 20 feet across at the bottom, and 90 feet across at the top. Just prior to sinking the tubes, a sand bed was prepared in the bottom of the trench to correct the grade. For this process, a special leveling device was designed. It consisted of a hollow rectangular raft of steel pontoons. Rails were placed on top of the pontoons, and a special carriage traveled back and forth over them, acting as a sweeper for the sand bed. The successful sinking of the tubes was largely due to the development of this ingenious device, which ensured that the sand bed was placed with great accuracy. It took 4 tugs about 3 hours to tow each tube upstream for final concreting and sinking. The balance of the outside layer of concrete was applied at an anchorage point about 300 feet above where the trench was being prepared. At that point, each completely concreted tube weighed 8,000 tons and was submerged about a foot below the surface of the water. Before the tube was sunk, tall masts were fastened to each end to serve as guides for the engineers to align the tube into position. A buoyancy scow was positioned over the submerged tube, and cables were connected to the tube ends. Blocks of concrete were applied to the ends of the tube to sink it into the waiting trench. One of the most difficult procedures during the construction of the tunnel was the sinking of the last tube section. Since the tube was almost as deep as the river itself, it dammed up a considerable amount of water. 4 25-ton anchors were placed in the bottom of the river, and 3 powerful tugs were positioned to pull against the anchors, hauling the tube back if it drifted too far downstream. As each consecutive tube was sunk, divers fastened them together with huge steel lug pins. When all of the tubes were locked together, divers placed steel forms around the joints and poured a collar of tremmy concrete. The tubes were then covered over with between 5 and 20 feet of backfill clay. Meanwhile, the third type of tunneling process, known as the shield-driven section, was slowly inching its way toward the underwater tube section already in place. The shield-driven sections began in a shaft near the end of the excavated land approaches and extended 30 feet beyond the harbor line. The shield used for boring through the earth was the largest in North America at the time, 32 feet in diameter and over 15 feet long. The progress of the shield as it inched its way through the earth resembled a giant mole. A gang of workmen, known as muckers or sandhogs, dug ahead of the shield, slicing away the clay with manually operated knives, then passing it back through the shield to others who moved it on little hopper cars to the surface. As soon as the muckers excavated a few feet in front of the equipment, the shield was forced ahead. Hydraulic jacks pushed the shield ahead 2.5 feet at a time. This was known as the shove. A series of airlocks maintained high air pressure inside the steel ring structure. The high pressure kept out the water. As the shield advanced forward, workmen poured the concrete for the interior walls and the roadway. Eventually, the big day arrived when the shield-driven sections made contact with the buried tunnel tubes. Incredibly, there was less than 1 inch of error. The bulkheads were torn down and the finishing work began. The roadway was paved with 2 million granite blocks, and the walls were tiled with over 200,000 enameled porcelain tiles. In addition to the tunnel itself, about 25 buildings were constructed at either end. Facilities for customs and immigration inspection areas were provided. Toll booths were built, and among the original buildings still standing are 2 large ventilation towers which house huge fans that continuously blow fresh air into the tunnel and extract stale air and exhaust fumes. These fans are capable of completely changing the air in the tunnel every 90 seconds. On November 1st, 1930, crowds gathered on both sides of the river to officially dedicate the new tunnel. The mayors of Windsor and Detroit made speeches, and President Herbert Hoover pressed a button from the White House, sounding gongs and signaling the start of a fireworks display. The crowds joined in choruses of 2 nations as Detroit and Windsor radio stations broadcast news of the tunnel's completion to hundreds of people across North America. Today, the tunnel looks much like it did when it first opened in 1930. But the Detroit end of the tunnel has been modernized and enlarged, and work has begun inside the tunnel to completely replace with new tiles the original porcelain enameled tiling on the walls. As it has for more than 50 years, the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel plays an important role in bringing good neighbors closer together and in providing new economic and travel opportunities for people on both sides of the river. Next time you enter the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel, take a few moments to recall the mammoth effort and the millions of dollars it took to construct the tunnel. You can take pride in knowing that the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel was the first and to this day is still the only underwater vehicle tunnel that connects two great cities and two great countries.
Okay. Let me turn on the lights. That was pretty cool. Okay. Hopefully you caught Jack Couch's name there at the end, Birmingham, Michigan. So it certainly was an amazing project, and this documentary really showed it quite well. Just the coordination that it took, some of the inventiveness that was required on the spot as they were working. You know, that initial mishap with the tube getting stuck in the sand there, it was pretty neat. They just created floats and they elevated it. So very interesting. But it was interesting, this whole thing about creating a river crossing, I should have pointed out, it took 50 years, though, of debate and controversy to get the initial crossing done. And then, anyways, here we are today with the continuing debate about a second bridge going across. So we'll see what happens with that. And anyways, so that's it. Oh, and one other sort of footnote. Fred Martin, the mayor of Windsor, died like a year after the tunnel opened, and he worked so hard at getting this project pushed through that the speculation is that he just wore himself out. And I understand that he was broke by the time this project was completed. But anyway, so with that, that concludes my presentation, so thank you.